Hello and welcome to the first lesson of this JavaScript Basics course. Now, hopefully by now you've downloaded our starter project from GitHub or inside of our previous lesson, the project setup. So go there if you haven't downloaded this already. Now, before we get going and start learning about JavaScript, what we want to do is have a quick look through our folder structure and our project setup that's included here. So at the beginning of this course, what we actually looked at were things such as Babel and ESLint and Webpack and NPM and how these tie together. Now, all of these exist inside this project. So throughout this course, we're going to be using all of the above. Now, the best place to start is probably with our actual source code. So here we have an index.html, which is going to serve as our base for this project. Now you can see we have a div with an ID and that has a value of app. So this is essentially going to be our entry point for our application as we get towards the end of this course and actually build out a real world project. But for now, we're going to use this and something called the console. If you haven't used the console in a browser before, we're going to be using these to look at and debug our JavaScript code. So with that in mind, let's have a look at our src directory. So this is our source directory, and you can see in here that we've imported some style.css, and we also have a reference to that div back inside our index.html. So this is how we're just querying the DOM, the document object model, and if you haven't learned about this yet, don't worry, we're going to cover this in a bit more detail. And finally, we have this inner HTML. Now, momentarily, when we boot up our project, we're going to see these spring into life. But let's continue this walkthrough of our project. Now, in terms of static assets, we have images, we have our fonts that we're using, and also any CSS that we're using throughout the project, just to give our page a bit more style. So that's pretty much it in terms of the actual source code. What we'll do is have a look at our Babel RC first. Now, this Babel RC essentially acts as a configuration file for Babel, so we don't need to touch it. This is the recommended default, having this preset dash environment. If you want to read more about these, we've included some project links above, so you can go and learn about each of these individual technologies in your own time. Now, let's also have a look at ESLint. ESLint will help us with our JavaScript code quality. So it's going to tell us if we're making some errors or referencing things that might not exist. So ESLint's very powerful, and we'll see it in action as we continue through the course. We also have our Webpack setup. You can see here that we don't have any rules for this directory name. So ESLint is already showing its magic and saying this directory name is not defined. Now, this isn't a problem. This is just how our configuration file sits. We're using a full ES6 Webpack setup here as well. We have some basic things. We have our entry file. So our entry file is the root file here, where we will be writing all of our JavaScript throughout the remainder of this course. We also have things such as where our output files are, the different types of module loaders that we're going to be using, followed by a plugin, and finally, probably the most important piece is some kind of development server, so we can live reload and see our changes happening on the fly as we continue to write JavaScript. Now, before we go any further, what we need to do is have a look at our package.json. Now, I've put this together for this project in particular. This is the starter repository for this particular course. Now, inside it, what we have are the dependencies. If you've not used NPM before, this might look kind of strange to you. However, it's simply a definition file of things that we want to simply install and include in this project. So these are our highly useful dependencies. You can see here that we have Babel, some different kind of loaders. We have our ESLint, a few plugins, and finally Webpack and the dev server. So essentially, these are just saying these are these descriptors that we want to include and run in this project, and the actual values here are simply the versions that might have been published to NPM. Now, we looked at NPM at the beginning of this course as well, and that is that package manager and that registry where all of these modules are held. So once we've installed them, what happens is we get this package-lock.json file, and this is something that we should then commit to version control. So let's go ahead then and actually get started. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal. Now, if you're using VS Code, you will automatically be inside of this project folder, so we can show what files we have available, and these correspond to these up here. Now, if you aren't inside, you'll need to cd into that project directory, perhaps from iterm or the standard terminal. But essentially, once we're inside of here, what we need to do is go ahead and run an npm install. Now, npm install is just a command, and having installed Node.js, we're now available to write this command. Now, I've got quite a useful tool installed on my terminal. So you can see here everything's nice and green, and if I spell something or have a command that doesn't actually exist, it will highlight it in red and let me know. So here, npm is completely available. We know it's definitely been installed, so we can safely go ahead and npm install. And once you've done that, hit enter, and everything's going to go ahead and install for this particular project. So once everything has installed, you'll see this node_modules. Now, it might be that you've chosen to hide this from your project by default, because you end up with all of these different files and dependencies inside our project, which we don't really need to see, so it can be favorable to turn these off. Now, essentially, everything that we have declared or specified in our development dependencies here has essentially been installed into node modules. If some of these dependencies have other dependencies, those dependencies are also installed inside our node modules. So that means that what we can do is now run an npm start. Now, because our dependencies have been pulled down from the package registry, when we run this npm start, it's actually going to kick off our scripts command and call this start here, which is our webpack-dev-server. So webpack dev server, we went ahead and installed down here. Now, this is then going to talk to our webpack config, create that local server for us, and essentially compile our project so we can view it in the browser. So let's go ahead and hit enter on that npm start, and hopefully you should see this message that the project is running at localhost 4000. Now, if we go ahead and command click, that will then bring this up in the browser. Now, for this course, I'm going to have this window next to me to the right, and if you've installed things correctly, you will also go to localhost 4000 and see this exact page as well. So that is the quick install of the project. In the next few videos, we're going to get started with writing our very first pieces of JavaScript.